History doesn't remember the loudest voices, it remembers the strongest hearts. Across centuries of chaos, crisis, and quiet revolutions, a few leaders stood taller than the storms around them. Not because they were flawless, but because they dared to fight anyway. This is the story of 15 presidents who carved greatness out of impossible moments and sometimes out of their own failures. Heroes, dreamers, flawed legends. Welcome to the greatest presidents of the United States. George Washington. Before there were amber waves of grain or rockets' red glare, there was a man who stood at the edge of a wilderness, staring into a future no one could see, leading a country that didn't yet exist. George Washington didn't ask for greatness. He certainly didn't expect it. He simply answered when history came pounding at his door. And because he did, America would begin not with a crown, but with a question. What does it mean to be free? Washington was born in 1732, a world where kings ruled with divine authority and ordinary men were taught to bow. His early life was marked more by practicality than poetry. Surveying land, measuring rivers, fighting in skirmishes on the frontier. He wasn't the golden boy of the colonies. He was ambitious, yes, but awkward in high society, an outsider among the Virginia elites who could smell the lack of old money on him. His formal education ended before it began. If anything, Washington's great achievement at first was simply staying alive longer than many of his peers. But ambition has a funny way of finding its window. When the colonial world began to boil under British rule, when taxes became chains and liberty became a dream worth bleeding for, Washington's reputation as a sturdy, dependable leader lifted him above the crowd. He was not the most brilliant speaker, nor the most radical thinker, but when the Continental Congress needed someone to command the army that barely existed, they chose the tall Virginian with the grave expression and the careful words. It was not an obvious path to glory. It was a suicide mission with a uniform. Washington took command in 1775, staring down the world's greatest military empire with a collection of farmers, merchants, and runaways. His army was chronically unpaid, perpetually underfed, frequently shoeless, and only occasionally sober. If he felt terror, and surely he did, he buried it beneath layers of stoicism so thick that even those closest to him rarely glimpsed the man beneath the marble. Through the brutal winters, through the humiliating retreats, through the constant specter of mutiny, Washington held the army together by sheer force of belief. Not belief that victory was inevitable. It wasn't. Not belief that God was on their side. Washington's writings suggest he was far too cautious to gamble on divine favor. No, what Washington believed in was perseverance. The stubborn refusal to die, the iron discipline to survive long enough to force destiny's hand. It was this slow, grinding, exhausting kind of greatness that turned him into a legend. It wasn't the battles he won, those were few and far between, but the battles he refused to lose. When he crossed the ice-choked Delaware River in December 1776 to launch a surprise attack on the Hessians at Trenton, it was not a grand military maneuver. It was a desperate roll of the dice to keep hope alive for just one more season. And when he won for once, it electrified the cause. Yet even after 7 punishing years of war, victory was not inevitable. The revolution stumbled across the finish line, more from British exhaustion than American triumph. When Yorktown fell and the British finally sued for peace, Washington stood atop a broken country, bankrupt, divided, teetering on the brink of collapse. No one would have blamed him if he had seized the moment to crown himself King George I of America. His officers whispered about it. Some practically begged him to take absolute power. Instead, he walked away. In 1783, Washington resigned his commission before Congress. The act stunned the world. No victorious general had willingly surrendered power like that since the days of the Roman Republic. King George III, when told of Washington's resignation, reportedly said, "If he does that, he will be the greatest man in the world." And so he did, and so he was. Of course, the world has a way of dragging reluctant heroes back into the fray. By 1787, the fledgling United States was unraveling. The Articles of Confederation had created a government too weak to tie its own shoelaces, let alone defend itself or pay its debts. Delegates begged Washington to preside over the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, not because they thought he had a brilliant constitutional theory, but because his mere presence could keep the fragile gathering from disintegrating into bickering and betrayal. He didn't speak often at the convention. He didn't have to. His silent authority loomed larger than any eloquent argument. When the Constitution was drafted, it was almost a given that Washington would become the first president. Nobody else could embody the ideal they were trying, clumsily, desperately, to invent. Power restrained by duty, ambition tempered by service. And once again, Washington didn't run for office so much as submit to it, like a condemned man submitting to his fate. He wrote privately that he felt like a culprit who is going to the place of execution. Still, he took the oath in 1789 on a chilly April day in New York City. No one knew what a president was supposed to do. There were no road maps, no rule books, just the terrifying blank page of history waiting to be written. Washington set the tone with careful steps. He created the first cabinet, Jefferson, Hamilton, Knox, Randolph, a collection of men so brilliant and combative that keeping them in the same room without starting a civil war became one of his daily miracles. He established the tradition of the peaceful transfer of power. He embodied the principle that the executive was a servant of the law, not its master. And yet, even the most heroic men are shadows in their own light. Washington owned hundreds of enslaved people at Mount Vernon. While he spoke the language of liberty and freedom, he profited from the unfreedom of others. He signed the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793, legally binding the federal government to the maintenance of slavery, even as he wrestled with the moral contradictions of the institution, freeing a handful of enslaved individuals in his will, hedging public statements. He lived within a system that his own rhetoric condemned. He also enforced the despised whiskey tax, provoking the first armed rebellion against federal authority. Washington crushed it personally, riding at the head of 13,000 troops into Pennsylvania to restore order. It was a strange image. The man who had led a revolution against taxation, now leading an army to enforce it. For a man so wary of power, Washington wielded it with a firm, sometimes ruthless hand when he believed the republic's survival was at stake. He was not a philosopher king. He was a battlefield pragmatist dressed in the robes of a statesman. His greatness lay not in his perfection, but in his imperfect fidelity to a set of ideals he never fully lived up to, but never stopped reaching toward. After 2 terms, Washington shocked the nation once again by refusing a third. It was a self-imposed limit that would become an unspoken rule, and later a constitutional amendment, defining the American presidency for centuries. In his farewell address, he warned against the dangers he saw gathering on the horizon, the corrosive venom of partisan politics, the entangling snares of permanent foreign alliances, the rise of regional divisions that could shatter the Union. He offered no solutions, only a prayer that the fragile experiment he had helped launch would outlive its creators. He retired to Mount Vernon, weary, scarred, and almost painfully human. When Washington died in December 1799, the news plunged the young country into mourning. Bells tolled in every city. Portraits were draped in black. Eulogies struggled to capture the enormity of the loss. The man who had refused to be king, refused to be tyrant, refused to be anything but what the moment demanded, was gone. They called him the father of his country. But George Washington was never a father in the easy, sentimental sense. He was the grim architect of a revolution that almost didn't survive its infancy, the reluctant midwife to a republic born screaming into a hostile world. And in a century when kings still ruled by divine right, when most men still believed freedom was a gift to be granted by someone else, Washington dared to live and die as if it were something a people could seize for themselves. But as America would soon learn, a nation can't live on heroes alone. It would need something more, something darker, something forged in fire and sorrow. It would need a man willing to tear the very soul of the nation apart in order to save it. It would need Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln. It's a peculiar thing, being born into obscurity and destined for immortality. Abraham Lincoln came into the world on a cold February morning in 1809 in a one-room log cabin in the middle of Kentucky nowhere. No fanfare, no prophecies, just another poor boy in a poor land, expected to live a poor life and die a poor death, if he was lucky enough to grow old at all. Fate, as it turns out, has a biting sense of humor. Lincoln's childhood was a collage of hard labor, ill-fitting homespun clothes, and books snatched in brief, guilty moments between farm chores. He learned to read late, but once he did, he devoured everything he could find: law books, poetry, political philosophy, anything that offered an escape from the brutal gravity of survival. His mother died when he was just 9 years old, and grief seeped into him early, an invisible thread woven through everything he would later become. He grew up tall and awkward, a scarecrow of a man, with a face too sad to be handsome and a voice too piercing to be ignored. By the time he reached adulthood, he had already become a living contradiction, a man of deep empathy wrapped in thick sarcasm, a jokester with a heart so heavy it often sank him into months-long depressions. America was changing fast around him, boiling with tensions that polite society tried not to name. The country was split down invisible seams, North against South, free against slave, progress against tradition, and every polite conversation about union was another stone added to the avalanche slowly gathering above them. Lincoln didn't set out to become the man who would catch it when it fell. He just kept standing there while everyone else ran away. In 1832, Lincoln ran for the Illinois state legislature and lost. 2 years later, he tried again and won. Then he studied law and built a modest practice. He debated in rough, sawdust-floored taverns, argued in drafty courtrooms, and honed a style of speaking that looked simple but could carve a man's arguments to ribbons with a few well-placed words. He entered Congress in 1847, but found Washington a nest of petty ambitions and self-deceptions. He served a single term and then voluntarily walked away. It seemed for a while that Lincoln might fade into the dusty rows of forgotten state politicians who never made it onto the big stage. But America had other plans. Or maybe, more precisely, America had other sins to settle. The 1850s tore the country's mask off. The Kansas-Nebraska Act, the Fugitive Slave Act, the bleeding violence in the territories, all made it clear that slavery was not some distant, regrettable necessity. It was the beating, bloody heart of American politics, and it would not be compromised into submission. Lincoln, who had long despised slavery but treated it like a regrettable reality of life, began to sharpen into something harder. He watched the Supreme Court's Dred Scott decision declare that black men had no rights, which the white man was bound to respect, and he felt the tremors in the nation's foundation. He saw Senator Stephen Douglas argue for popular sovereignty. The cowards compromised that pretended slavery was just a matter of local preference, and he decided that half measures were not enough. In 1858, he faced off against Douglas in a series of debates that would define his career and, in many ways, define America's future. Lincoln's voice rang out across dusty fields and crowded town squares. A house divided against itself cannot stand. It was not a threat. It was a prophecy. Lincoln lost that Senate race, but he won something larger, a national conscience. 2 years later, when the country careened toward dissolution, the newly born Republican Party turned to Lincoln. Not because he was the most radical abolitionist, not because he was the most charismatic, but because he was the one man who could hold together a coalition of Northerners who barely agreed on anything except that the current trajectory meant doom. He was elected president in November 1860. Before he could even unpack his bags, 7 southern states had seceded from the Union. By the time he took the oath of office, the country had effectively shattered. Lincoln faced a catastrophe without precedent, a rebellion not by foreign invaders, but by Americans against America itself. The government was broke, the army was tiny, the navy was scattered, and half the population viewed Lincoln not as their president, but as their mortal enemy. This was the part where most men would have broken. Lincoln simply straightened his shoulders, adjusted his stovepipe hat, and walked into the fire. When Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter in April 1861, the Civil War officially began. It would be 4 years of slaughter on a scale no one could have imagined. 4 years of brothers killing brothers, of towns turned into mass graves, of fields fertilized with blood and bone. Lincoln's task was impossible: to preserve a union that had never been truly united, to destroy an institution older than the Constitution itself, and to do it all without becoming the very tyrant the Founding Fathers had feared. He stumbled, he hesitated, he suspended habeas corpus, he censored newspapers, he tolerated incompetent generals far longer than he should have. He agonized over the Emancipation Proclamation, waiting until 1863 to finally declare that enslaved people in Confederate-held territories were free, not because he suddenly discovered a passion for abolition, but because he realized that emancipation was now a military necessity. Freedom, it turned out, was not simply a moral imperative, it was a weapon, and yet, when Lincoln finally wielded it, he did so with the full force of a man who had finally realized the size of the battle he was truly fighting, not just for a union, but for a soul. The war dragged on, devouring men like a fire that could not be quenched. Gettysburg, Antietam, Chickamauga, Cold Harbor, the names bled together in an endless dirge. By the end of 1863, it seemed the North might lose, not because it lacked armies, but because it lacked the will to keep going. At Gettysburg, standing on ground where tens of thousands had died for reasons half forgotten, Lincoln gave a short, ragged speech that would outlive him by centuries. Government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. It was not a boast. It was a prayer. By 1864, Lincoln's re-election seemed impossible. The war was still raging. Death lists filled newspapers. Inflation ravaged the North. His own party mutinied against him. But then, like a thunderclap, Union victories rolled in. Sherman's march to the sea, Grant's brutal hammering of Confederate lines. Lincoln won re-election by a landslide, and with it, a fragile mandate to finish what he had started. He moved swiftly. The 13th Amendment, abolishing slavery, pushed through Congress just months before the war's end. By April 1865, the Confederacy was dying. On April 9th, General Robert E. Lee surrendered at Appomattox. For the first time in 4 years, there was peace. Lincoln allowed himself a few moments of relief. 5 days later, he was dead. John Wilkes Booth's bullet tore through the back of his head at Ford's Theater on Good Friday, April 14th, 1865. Lincoln died the next morning, a martyr to a cause he had not fully chosen, but had carried to its brutal conclusion. The nation wept. And then, as nations do, it forgot the hardest lessons he tried to teach. Lincoln had tried to warn them. With malice toward none, with charity for all, he had begged the country not to seek vengeance, not to replace one tyranny with another. They didn't listen. Reconstruction would collapse into bitterness, betrayal, and new forms of oppression. The wounds Lincoln had tried to bind would fester for a century. And beyond. Still, Lincoln's ghost lingered in the American imagination, the awkward giant who spoke like a prophet and bled like a man, the leader who led a country through its darkest hour, not by force of arms alone, but by the stubborn, tragic, beautiful belief that government could be a thing worth saving, even when the people themselves were not sure they deserved it. History would paint him in marble, but Lincoln's real legacy was grittier, sadder, and infinitely more human. He didn't save America. He showed America that it could be saved if it was willing to pay the price, and that lesson would echo forward into every crisis the country would ever face, because the story of America would never be a story of perfection. It would always be a story of fighting for it. The Union survived because of Lincoln's will. But would it thrive? That was a different question entirely. To build a future from the ashes of war, America would need a new kind of leader, a man who would face economic catastrophe, global war, and polio, and still stand taller than any of them, a man whose very initials would come to symbolize hope in a hopeless world. Franklin D. Roosevelt. By the time Franklin Delano Roosevelt took the oath of office in March 1933, America wasn't just suffering, it was sinking. Banks collapsing, families starving, streets full of cold, shuffling ghosts of men who once had jobs, dreams, homes, and now had none. Democracy itself was cracking under the weight of despair. Across the oceans, authoritarian wolves were circling. Mussolini had already seized Italy. Hitler was roaring into power in Germany. Stalin was building gulags under the Siberian stars. The world was learning all over again that when hope dies, monsters are born. And standing there on the platform with his cigarette holder cocked at a Johnny angle, his body braced against the braces no one could see, was a man who promised that hope would not die here. Franklin Roosevelt smiled at the abyss and dared it to swallow him whole. He'd been born into privilege so vast that it barely touched the ground. Hyde Park estates, Harvard educations, family trees shaded by the tallest branches of American aristocracy. If the American dream was supposed to be about rising from nothing, FDR's life looked suspiciously like starting at the finish line. But privilege doesn't insulate anyone from suffering forever. In 1921, at just 39 years old, Roosevelt was struck down by polio, a disease that stripped him of the ability to walk, that left him dragging useless legs behind him like anchors. It could have ended him. It could have buried him in the polite irrelevance reserved for the broken sons of powerful families. Instead, it rebuilt him. It taught him the thing his golden childhood had never required: resilience. When Franklin Roosevelt returned to politics, he wasn't the same man. He was something harder, smarter, more ruthless, and infinitely more dangerous to his enemies and to history itself. By the time he ran for president in 1932, Roosevelt wasn't just promising a new deal for the American people. He was promising to save the American experiment itself from slow, shivering death. And the people, exhausted and terrified, handed him the keys to a car that was already wrapped around a tree. Roosevelt didn't blink. He roared the engine to life. Within his first 100 days, an arbitrary number now mythologized into political folklore, Roosevelt pushed through a dizzying array of legislation: Emergency Banking Acts, Civilian Conservation Corps, Agricultural Adjustment Acts, Public Works Administrations. He threw policy at the Depression like a man trying to patch a sinking ship with whatever wood he could find. Did all of it work? Not even close. Some programs failed spectacularly. Some got struck down by the Supreme Court. Some were pure experiments in organized chaos. But for the first time in years, the American people felt something stirring in their blood: motion. Someone finally was doing something. Roosevelt's greatest weapon wasn't any single policy. It was faith. Not blind faith, not naive optimism, but the stubborn, steel-spine belief that problems were meant to be solved, not surrendered to. And he wielded that weapon with terrifying effectiveness. His fireside chats crackled through the static of America's living rooms, his warm, patrician voice threading into homes where hope had worn thin. He spoke not like a distant monarch, but like a neighbor leaning over a backyard fence, explaining the complexities of banking crises and legislative initiatives in words that even a coal miner could understand. He promised nothing but hard work, discipline, sacrifice, and the chance to fight for a better future. It was enough. By 1936, Roosevelt was a colossus. He won re-election with one of the largest electoral margins in American history. Only a few pinpricks of Republican red survived across the map. It looked, for a fleeting moment, as if the New Deal coalition might forge an unbreakable American future. But nothing in Roosevelt's life, or in America's, was ever that simple. Underneath the high rhetoric, cracks were growing. Roosevelt's court-packing plan of 1937, an attempt to bend the Supreme Court to his will by adding more justices sympathetic to his policies, was a clumsy, naked grab for power, one that even his allies recoiled from. His economic policies faced sharp criticism. Some said he hadn't done enough. Others claimed he was strangling free enterprise with bureaucracy. Southern Democrats, once part of his coalition, bristled against his mild gestures toward civil rights. Unions grew restless. Business leaders grew furious. And looming beyond domestic squabbles was the gathering storm of war. While America nursed its wounds, Europe was bleeding out. Hitler annexed Austria, then the Sudetenland, then Czechoslovakia. Appeasement failed. Treaties crumbled. By 1939, the world was at war again. And America, scarred by the horror of World War I, wanted no part of it. Roosevelt understood two truths that most of his fellow citizens refused to face. First, that the oceans would not save them this time. Second, that evil never stays politely within its borders. But presidents are not kings. Roosevelt could only prepare America slowly, by stealth and persuasion, pushing aid to Britain under the guise of Lend-Lease, building up the military while swearing hand over heart that America would never be drawn into the conflict. And then Pearl Harbor exploded across the December sky, and isolationism died in a single day of fire. Roosevelt declared war with a voice that shook the airwaves, a date which will live in infamy. The country that had barely been able to feed itself a decade before, now mobilized with a fury unmatched in human history. Factories roared back to life. Women flooded into the workforce. The economy snapped awake. Rosie the Riveter swung her hammer. GIs trained on dusty parade grounds. Roosevelt became a wartime president, a commander not of armies directly, but of a spirit, a national momentum that he stoked with every speech, every fireside chat, every appeal to sacrifice. He built the arsenal of democracy. He forged alliances with the equally battered leaders of Britain and the Soviet Union, men who hated each other almost as much as they hated Hitler. He navigated the treacherous politics of global war with a strategist's mind and a gambler's heart, and through it all, he hid the true extent of his own failing health. The man who once could barely walk now could barely stand. Heart disease, hypertension, and exhaustion ravaged him behind closed doors. His famous grin became thinner, his speeches slower, his steps shorter, but he refused to yield. Because Roosevelt understood something fundamental. The presidency is not about the president. It's about the country. He saw World War II not just as a war for territory, but as a war for the soul of the 20th century. And he intended to make sure that America emerged from it not just victorious, but transformed. Roosevelt didn't live to see the end of the war. On April 12th, 1945, while sitting for a portrait in Warm Springs, Georgia, he complained of a sudden blinding headache and then slumped over dead within minutes. The nation he left behind was stunned. It was as if the sun itself had gone out at noon. Roosevelt had been president so long that for millions of Americans, he was the only leader they had ever known. Children wept in the streets. Farmers stopped plowing their fields. Soldiers in muddy trenches in Europe and the Pacific read the news in stunned silence. In death, as in life, Roosevelt remained a paradox, a patrician who became the champion of the poor, a crippled man who led a broken nation back to its feet, a president who accumulated unprecedented power but left behind a stronger democracy rather than a weaker one. Not every choice he made was noble. Japanese-American internment camps stained his legacy with fear and betrayal. Political maneuvering sometimes took precedence over moral clarity. Power tempted him, and at times he yielded. But Franklin Roosevelt's greatness did not lie in his perfection. It lay in his persistence. He taught America that despair is not destiny, that hope, battered and bloodied, can still stagger forward, that leadership means giving people something bigger than themselves to believe in. And he left behind something far rarer than monuments or memorials. He left behind the memory of a nation that had faced death and refused to die. But the fire of crisis never goes out for long. And sometimes it takes more than hope to keep it burning clean. Sometimes it takes raw, elemental energy. A man who charges into history like a charging bull, snorting and stomping and daring the world to say no. A man who once delivered speeches from barrooms and battlefields alike. Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt was not born to be subtle. He came roaring into the world on October 27, 1858, in a brownstone mansion in New York City, kicking and coughing and demanding from his first breath to be noticed. His parents called him TD. He was sickly, asthmatic, frail, and yet in some deeper way, unstoppable. From the beginning, Roosevelt treated life like an enemy to be charged, tackled, wrestled into submission. Weak lungs, he built up his body with boxing gloves and barbells. Shyness, he buried it under endless, breathless words. Sadness, he rode horses faster, climbed mountains higher, shot guns louder. If there was a wall, Roosevelt was the kind of man who would sprint headlong into it just to see what it felt like to break through. He came from money, but not from entitlement. His father, Theodore Sr., taught him that privilege was a debt to be repaid with service. His mother, Martha Mitty Bullock, taught him the fierce, often reckless pride of the old Southern aristocracy. In Roosevelt's bloodstream, idealism and combativeness swirled together, forging a personality too large to fit politely into Gilded Age drawing rooms. By his early 20s, Roosevelt had already graduated from Harvard, published his first book, and launched a political career in the raucous jungle of New York State politics. He wasn't like the other young aristocrats playing at governance. He threw himself into the muck of the machine wards and factory floors, hunting corruption like a hound scenting blood. He was arrogant, he was relentless, he was annoying. He was also somehow exactly what a rotting political system didn't know it desperately needed. Then came the first great blow of his life, the one even his ferocious optimism couldn't punch through. In 1884, within hours of each other, Roosevelt's mother and his young wife, Alice, died in the same house. His diary for that day contains only a large black X and a sentence written in a shaky hand. The light has gone out of my life. Broken, hollowed, he fled to the badlands of the Dakota Territory to lose himself in the endless skies and brutal winters. He hunted, he herded cattle, he fought with outlaws and with the land itself. He rebuilt himself, bone by bone, breath by ragged breath. When he returned to the East, he wasn't just a man who had tasted grief. He was a man who understood how quickly the world could kill you, and how urgently you had to live before it did. Roosevelt climbed the rungs of political life with explosive speed. Civil Service Commissioner, Police Commissioner of New York City, Assistant Secretary of the Navy. At every step, he made enemies and headlines with equal vigor. He was impossible to ignore, a dynamo of reform and rhetoric, a man who seemed to embody the restless, rising energy of an America straining at the leash of the old world. When the Spanish-American War broke out in 1898, Roosevelt didn't just cheer from the sidelines. He resigned his cushy post and raised the Rough Riders, a ragtag regiment of Ivy League athletes, cowboys, and Native Americans. He charged up San Juan Hill in Cuba with a pistol in one hand and a saber in the other, bullet whizzing by, glasses fogging, yelling like a man possessed. He returned a national hero, the living, breathing ideal of American masculinity. Political bosses tried to bury him safely in the vice presidency in 1900, making him William McKinley's running mate to get him out of the way. But fate, as it often does, had other plans. When an anarchist's bullet killed McKinley in September 1901, Theodore Roosevelt became the 26th president of the United States, the youngest ever to hold the office at just 42 years old. Washington, D.C. braced itself. It wasn't ready. Roosevelt exploded into the presidency like a hurricane in a china shop. He shook hands with grimy coal miners and dined with European ambassadors. He tangled with corrupt railroad barons and charmed little children. He fought monopolies, built national parks, summoned fleets, and mediated wars. Where his predecessors had often treated the presidency like a ceremonial role, a dignified steward of existing institutions, Roosevelt treated it like a pulpit, a forge, a battering ram. He called it the bully pulpit, and he used it to hammer the conscience of the nation. He launched the Square Deal, promising fairness for workers, consumers, and businesses alike. He went after corporate monopolies with lawsuits that splintered the titans of industry. He intervened personally in the coal strike of 1902, forcing mine owners to negotiate with labor unions, a shocking breach of laissez-faire tradition. Roosevelt didn't just break the mold, he shattered it, ground the pieces under his boots, and built something new. He believed deeply and ferociously that government had a moral duty to protect its people, not merely to serve the rich or preserve tradition. He fought for food safety regulations, drug inspections, and conservation of natural resources at a scale that would have made even the ancient kings of Europe look like negligent landlords. It wasn't just policy. It was a vision of America as a living, breathing organism, a thing that needed care, energy, courage, and yet, as with every great man, the shadow followed close behind the light. Roosevelt's love for power, his sheer glee at wielding it, sometimes veered into dangerous arrogance. He expanded executive authority far beyond anything the Founding Fathers had imagined. He bypassed Congress. He bullied courts. He launched a secret, unauthorized intervention to support a Panamanian rebellion simply so America could secure the rights to build a canal. He bragged about speaking softly and carrying a big stick, but often Roosevelt just skipped the soft-speaking part altogether. He romanticized war, glorying in the idea of righteous conflict, even as the costs mounted in blood and bone. He could be blind to the sufferings of non-white peoples, justifying imperialist ventures with a paternalistic racism that stained his grand visions with ugly hypocrisies. Nothing says national greatness like a battleship named after yourself sailing to colonize someone else's island. And yet, even at his worst, Roosevelt's flaws sprang from excess energy rather than malice. He was a man too large for the age he was born into, a comet blazing across a sky that didn't know what to do with the fire. In 1904, he won election in his own right, crushing his opponent by the largest popular margin in decades. He promised the people he would not seek another term, a promise he would later deeply regret. After stepping down in 1909, he grew restless almost immediately, watching with frustration as his chosen successor, William Howard Taft, undid parts of Roosevelt's legacy. By 1912, Roosevelt was back, furious, defiant, launching the progressive Bull Moose Party and running for president again. In the middle of the campaign, while preparing to give a speech in Milwaukee, Roosevelt was shot in the chest by a would-be assassin. The bullet lodged in his ribcage. Roosevelt coughed, checked to see if blood was filling his lungs, decided it wasn't, and proceeded to deliver a 90-minute speech, with the bullet still inside him. A normal man might cancel the evening. Roosevelt considered it a light cardio workout. Despite the bravado, Roosevelt lost the 1912 election. The split between him and Taft handed victory to Woodrow Wilson. It was, in some ways, the beginning of Roosevelt's long, ragged twilight. He went on expeditions to the Amazon, where he nearly died of fever and exhaustion. He campaigned bitterly for U.S. intervention in World War I. He lost his youngest son, Quentin, in the war, a grief that hollowed out the roaring lion into something smaller, sadder. On January 6, 1919, Theodore Roosevelt died in his sleep at Sagamore Hill. The vice president at the time, Thomas Marshall, upon hearing the news, said simply, "Death had to take Roosevelt sleeping, for if he had been awake, there would have been a fight." He left behind a country permanently changed, a presidency no longer passive but active, a government no longer merely ceremonial but moral, or at least aspiring to be. He left behind mountains and forests preserved for generations, corporations that knew, even if only dimly, that there were limits to their power, workers who could dream of fairness, children who could dream of playgrounds instead of factories. Roosevelt had tried, in his reckless, relentless way, to drag America closer to the country it had always claimed to be. He didn't succeed completely. No one ever does. But in his charging, grinning, furious way, he proved that ambition could be bent toward greatness, and that even a world built for the powerful could sometimes be made to answer to the powerless. But the age of roaring lions would not last forever. A new kind of leader was needed, one shaped not by empire, but by the hard, slow grind of pragmatism. A man who would fight not with fiery speeches, but with steel nerves and quiet resolve. Harry S. Truman. When Harry S. Truman first stepped into the White House as President of the United States, he looked more like an anxious accountant than a world leader. His wire-rimmed glasses glinted nervously. His suits were slightly too square. His voice had the dry, Midwestern twang of a man more familiar with farm rows than corridors of power. He wasn't supposed to be here. Not really. Truman had been vice president for just 82 days when Franklin Roosevelt died unexpectedly in April 1945. He had been kept in the dark about most of the country's deepest secrets, including the existence of the atomic bomb. Now, with barely a warning, he was commander-in-chief of the most powerful, most dangerous nation in human history, at a moment when that power teetered between salvation and annihilation. It would have been understandable if Truman had balked, if he had cracked under the weight. He didn't. Instead, he squared his shoulders, looked the unimaginable straight in the eye, and said the simple, stubborn words that would define his presidency: "The buck stops here." He was born in 1884 in Lamar, Missouri, a scrappy kid with poor eyesight and a fierce, stubborn streak that no hardship could grind out. He grew up plowing fields and playing piano, reading everything he could find: Plutarch's Lives, histories of great generals, the Bible. He dreamed of glory, of heroism, of proving that a nobody from nowhere could matter. Life, of course, didn't make it easy. He tried college, couldn't afford to finish. He tried business, failed spectacularly. He went to war in 1917, commanding an artillery unit in France, where he finally earned the respect he'd craved his whole life. After returning, he opened a haberdashery, a hat store, that went bankrupt within 2 years. By his early 30s, Truman was broke, humiliated, tethered to debts he would spend years paying off dollar by dollar. Nothing says future world leader like getting destroyed by the men's fashion industry. And yet somehow Truman's relentless work ethic and unpretentious charm caught the eye of Tom Pendergast, Kansas City's notorious political boss. With Pendergast's backing And, frankly, because nobody else wanted the job, Truman was elected county judge, then U.S. Senator. In the Senate, Truman found his stride. He wasn't flashy, he wasn't visionary, but he was brutally efficient. During World War II, he chaired the Senate War Investigating Committee, exposing billions of dollars in waste and fraud in military contracts. He earned a reputation as the little man from Missouri who gets things done. That reputation and Roosevelt's need for a safe, inoffensive running mate in 1944 catapulted Truman into the vice presidency. It was supposed to be a polite, quiet job. Ceremonial. Harmless. Instead, it became the most explosive promotion in history. On April 12, 1945, Harry Truman was summoned to the White House and told that Roosevelt was dead. Within hours, he took the oath of office. His hand shook as he signed his first official papers. He asked Roosevelt's cabinet to stay on, at least for a while. He didn't know where the files were. He barely knew who the players were. And most urgently, he didn't know that across the Pacific, a bomb had been built that could turn entire cities into shadows. Truman had to learn fast. Within weeks, Germany surrendered, ending the war in Europe, but Japan fought on. The Japanese military showed no sign of surrendering. Casualty projections for a land invasion of Japan ranged from hundreds of thousands to over 1 million American lives lost. Faced with that grim calculus, Truman made the most horrifying decision any leader has ever made. He authorized the use of atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. On August 6th and August 9th, 1945, mushroom clouds rose over cities that once teemed with life. Over 200,000 people died, many in an instant, others in slow agony. The war ended days later. Victory has many fathers. Mass death, it seems, has only reluctant midwives. Truman defended his choice with steely conviction. He believed it had saved lives, both American and Japanese, by ending the war swiftly, and perhaps it did. But the images of Hiroshima's charred ruins would follow America and Truman like a ghost at every feast of peace that came afterward. The world entered a new age, split between hope and horror, and Harry Truman had drawn the line with trembling hands. Even after the war, Truman's challenges multiplied. Europe lay in ruins. Asia smoldered with revolution. The Soviet Union, once a reluctant ally, now grew fangs. The Cold War began not with a bang, but with an iron curtain falling across Eastern Europe, and Truman knew instinctively that appeasement was no longer an option. He unveiled the Truman Doctrine in 1947, pledging that America would support free peoples resisting subjugation, an open declaration of ideological war against communism. It was bold. It was terrifying. It was the beginning of half a century of proxy wars, arms races, and existential dread. In the same breath, Truman launched the Marshall Plan, an unprecedented, lavish rebuilding effort for Europe, pouring billions into battered economies to stave off the political chaos that might breed new Hitlers or new Stalins. It was a gamble on hope. It was also the most expensive bribe in human history, and it worked. Western Europe rose from the ashes not through charity alone, but through cold, hard, strategic investment. Truman understood something many others missed. Prosperity was the best weapon against tyranny. At home, his presidency was a whirlwind of conflict and contradiction. He desegregated the armed forces, an audacious step toward racial justice decades before it would become politically convenient. He pushed for national health insurance and civil rights legislation, both of which were savagely killed in Congress. He battled strikes, inflation, and the lingering exhaustion of a country trying to remember how to live in peacetime. And in 1948, he faced political annihilation. Republicans were confident. Southern Democrats bolted the party over Truman's civil rights stance. Progressive Democrats formed a third-party bid. Newspapers printed early headlines declaring his defeat. Harry Truman boarded a train and launched a whistle-stop campaign across America, giving fiery speeches from the back of railcars, hammering away at the do-nothing Congress, and rallying working-class voters. He didn't just win. He stunned the world with one of the greatest political upsets in American history. Apparently, nobody had warned the voters that they were supposed to surrender. Yet, Truman's second term was no victory lap. The Cold War deepened. China fell to communism. The Soviet Union tested its own atomic bomb. And in 1950, North Korea invaded South Korea, dragging America into another bloody, grinding war on a distant peninsula. The Korean War became Truman's nightmare, a war he didn't start, couldn't win, and couldn't afford to lose. He clashed bitterly with General Douglas MacArthur, the brilliant insubordinate commander who wanted to bomb China itself. When MacArthur publicly defied Truman's orders, Truman fired him, an act of constitutional courage that nearly destroyed his presidency. Public support collapsed. Poll numbers cratered. Truman became a national punching bag, blamed for everything from inflation to communism to the weather. In 1952, weary and battered, he chose not to run again. He returned home to Independence, Missouri, not to wealth, not to accolades, but to a small house and a pension so meager he had to sell family land to survive. In later years, Americans would remember Truman differently, not as a slick politician, not as a brilliant strategist, but as something rarer, a man who did what he thought was right, no matter how much it cost him. He didn't reshape the world with grand rhetoric or sweeping idealism. He did it with blunt, stubborn endurance, the unglamorous heroism of a farmer's son who refused to run from history's hardest moments. His presidency was messy, complicated, tragic, triumphant. It was America, distilled into one small, stubborn man, standing at the edge of the unknown and refusing to flinch. He taught the country that greatness isn't always shiny, that courage sometimes looks like grit, that the buck in the end really does stop somewhere, and sometimes, if you're very lucky, it stops with someone willing to pay the price. But before Truman could defend the dream of democracy with bombs and doctrines, another man had to invent that dream in the first place, a man who scribbled freedom onto parchment with one hand and clutched contradictions in the other, a man who dreamed so hard he almost outran his own sins. Thomas Jefferson. There's something both beautiful and dangerous about dreamers. They see futures no one else can. They build cathedrals in the air. They write down ideals so pure they shimmer like mirages over a desert of human weakness. Thomas Jefferson was one of those dreamers, the most eloquent, contradictory, magnificent, maddening one America would ever produce. Born in 1743 in the rolling hills of Virginia, Jefferson grew up wrapped in privilege and expectation, a third-generation plantation owner, a son of the Southern aristocracy, educated in Latin, Greek, science, law, and philosophy, while still young enough to be terrified of thunderstorms. He wasn't the loudest man in any room. He didn't need to be. He carried within him a private, burning sense of destiny, the belief that man could and must be better than his circumstances. He saw the world as a puzzle to be solved by reason, a machine that could run more perfectly if only men could summon the courage to recalibrate it. In another century, Jefferson might have been a cloistered philosopher, arguing over candlelit manuscripts, but he was born into an era of revolution, and he intended not just to think about liberty, but to invent it. By 1775, the colonies were already boiling toward rebellion. Jefferson's reputation as a writer, sharp, clear, devastating, had spread beyond Virginia's red clay borders. So, when the Continental Congress needed someone to draft a declaration announcing their treason against the greatest empire on earth, they turned to him. At just 33 years old, Thomas Jefferson sat down at a desk in a stuffy Philadelphia boarding house and began to write words that would ring down through centuries. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. It was a promise, a sword, and a time bomb. Jefferson poured every ounce of his luminous faith in humanity into the Declaration of Independence. And when it was done, he looked up from the page, blinking into history. Of course, history has a cruel sense of irony. The man who proclaimed that all men are created equal owned more than 600 enslaved people over the course of his life. The man who wrote so movingly about liberty kept his own children, born from an enslaved woman, Sally Hemings, in chains of silence and ambiguity. Jefferson knew. He knew the contradiction, knew the rot at the roots of his beloved tree of liberty. And he spent the rest of his life trying, failing, and sometimes pretending not to notice the chasm between the world he imagined and the one he profited from. Philosophy is always easier when you're not personally in the footnotes. After the Revolution, Jefferson's star only rose higher. He served as governor of Virginia, minister to France, first Secretary of State under George Washington. He tangled bitterly with Alexander Hamilton, loathing the idea of a strong, centralized government, fearing that the revolution would devour itself by becoming the very tyranny it had rebelled against. Jefferson wanted a republic of yeoman farmers, sturdy, independent, virtuous citizens living close to the soil, free from the corrupting influence of banks, cities, and monarchies. In 1796, he ran for president and lost, coming in second to John Adams, which, under the strange rules of the early Constitution, made him vice president instead. Nothing encourages executive harmony quite like forced political marriages. The election of 1800 would prove even more chaotic. A brutal, venomous contest that nearly tore the fledgling nation apart. Jefferson and his allies attacked Adams as a wannabe king. Adams's camp slandered Jefferson as an atheist, a French puppet, a radical hell-bent on unleashing bloody revolution on American soil. It came down to a deadlock in the Electoral College. For days, Congress was paralyzed. Ballots cast and recast, factions threatening violence. Finally, after tense backroom negotiations and a few well-placed nudges, Thomas Jefferson emerged victorious. And just like that, America survived its first real test, a peaceful transfer of power between bitter rivals. No kings, no coups, no armies marching on the Capitol. Just ballots and a dream, bruised but still breathing. Jefferson's inauguration in 1801 was simple, almost awkward by today's standards. He walked to the Capitol without an escort, wore plain clothes, tried to erase the pomp and ceremony that monarchy had made synonymous with leadership. He spoke of reconciliation, of healing, of uniting the bitter factions now snarling across the young republic. We are all Republicans. We are all Federalists. It was an idealistic sentiment, and like many of Jefferson's ideals, it would prove more beautiful in theory than in practice. As president, Jefferson governed with a light touch when possible and a ruthless one when necessary. He slashed federal spending. He reduced the size of the military. He repealed internal taxes. He imagined a nation small, nimble, and virtuous, a country that could flourish without the heavy hand of government crushing its spirit. But the world rarely obliges dreamers. In 1703, Jefferson faced the opportunity and the moral conundrum of a lifetime. The Louisiana Purchase, Napoleon strapped for cash and, increasingly disinterested in his New World holdings, offered to sell the vast Louisiana territory to the United States. It would double the size of the country overnight. It would secure control of the Mississippi River. It would fulfill Jefferson's vision of an empire of farmers stretching across the continent. There was just one problem. The Constitution didn't explicitly authorize the president to buy land. Jefferson, the strict constitutionalist who had spent years decrying federal overreach, suddenly found himself reaching so far beyond the letter of the law, he might as well have been writing a new chapter. He bought the land anyway. Apparently, constitutional purity is easier to uphold when it doesn't include 828,000 square miles of prime real estate. The Louisiana Purchase was one of the most important acts in American history, and one of the most glaring examples of Jefferson's flexibility when ideals collided with opportunity. It was a triumph. It was also a harbinger. Jefferson's second term was rockier. Relations with Britain and France, already strained, collapsed into chaos. Both European powers seized American ships, bullied American sailors, and treated American neutrality like a bad joke. Jefferson responded with the Embargo Act of 1807, a sweeping ban on trade with foreign nations. The goal was to punish Britain and France economically. The result was that American merchants, sailors, and farmers suffered catastrophic losses. The economy nosedived. Smuggling exploded. Jefferson's vision of noble, self-sufficient farmers ran aground on the reality that even virtuous citizens need to sell their crops to survive. Public opinion, once worshipful, turned savage. By the end of his presidency, Jefferson was battered, exhausted, and ready, almost desperate, to retire. He handed the reins to his friend and ally, James Madison, and withdrew to Monticello, his beloved mountaintop home. There, Jefferson dreamed new dreams. He founded the University of Virginia, designing the campus himself, believing that education could elevate the human spirit beyond its basest instincts. He corresponded with old enemies and friends alike. He pondered the mysteries of government, nature, and the soul, and he lived long enough to see, on July 4th, 1826, the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, the country he had helped invent reached a kind of mythic apotheosis. That morning, Jefferson, old and frail, slipped into unconsciousness. He died a few hours later. John Adams, his rival turned friend, would die that same day, reportedly murmuring, "Thomas Jefferson survives." He didn't, but his ideas did. Thomas Jefferson left behind a country still struggling to live up to the soaring poetry he had written with such easy grace. He left behind a paradox, a nation founded on equality but marred by slavery, a democracy of liberty governed by ambition and compromise, a dream haunted by the weight of its own sins. Jefferson didn't resolve those contradictions. He simply wrote them down and dared the future to try. And in that audacity, perhaps, lies his true greatness. He believed in America not as it was, but as it could be. And he gave it the tools and the terrible burden of having to reach for itself. But dreams, no matter how eloquent, must eventually face the cold steel of reality. And America would soon need a different kind of leader, a man who understood that freedom wasn't a theory, but something you had to fight for mile by bloody mile across the fields of Europe. Dwight D. Eisenhower. Some men are built for chaos. Dwight D. Eisenhower was built for order. He came into the world in 1890, one of 7 sons born to a modest family in Denison, Texas, and raised on the hard-edged plains of Kansas. His was a life shaped by duty, by discipline, and by the endless grinding work of making something of yourself when nothing was guaranteed and everything had to be earned. There was nothing flashy about young Ike. No poetic declarations, no philosophical musings, just a square jaw, a steady hand, and a deep-seated belief that chaos could be beaten back by preparation, perseverance, and sheer force of will. Eisenhower's path to greatness was not paved by brilliance. It was paved by reliability. He wasn't the top student at West Point. He wasn't the most decorated soldier after World War I. For years, he shuffled papers, supervised training camps, served under generals who would forget his name the moment he left the room. He built a reputation for calm competence, and for an ambition so tightly controlled it barely showed. When World War II exploded across Europe, Eisenhower's fortunes changed overnight. The military needed men who could think strategically, who could manage impossible logistics, who could keep multinational egos from tearing each other apart, men who could plan the largest amphibious invasion in human history without losing their sanity or their soul. Eisenhower was the man. In 1942, he was appointed Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe. He orchestrated Operation Torch in North Africa, then the invasion of Sicily, and then the granddaddy of them all, D-Day. June 6, 1944, D-Day was not inevitable. It was a breathtaking gamble, an operation so massive that failure could have meant not just military defeat, but the collapse of Western civilization itself. Eisenhower knew it. The night before the invasion, he wrote 2 statements, one for success and one accepting full blame in the event of failure. No excuses, no finger-pointing, just ownership. The invasion succeeded, of course, at a monstrous cost, and Eisenhower's name was etched into the bedrock of history. By 1945, he was a hero not just in America, but around the world. He could have ridden that wave to almost any destiny he wanted. He chose to keep serving. After the war, Eisenhower became president of Columbia University, trying and largely failing to civilize academia the same way he had organized armies. He briefly served as the first Supreme Commander of NATO, building the infrastructure of collective security to stand against Soviet expansion. And then in 1952, with America mired in the Cold War, Korea bleeding, and Washington descending into poisonous partisanship, both political parties tried to court him to run for president. He chose the Republicans, not because he was a dogmatic conservative, but because he believed their platform better aligned with his instincts: fiscal prudence, limited government, strong defense. He won the presidency in a landslide. Dwight D. Eisenhower came into the White House not as a revolutionary, not as a demagogue, not as a savior. He came as a steward, a leader who believed that the greatest acts of governance were the ones you barely noticed, because they kept the chaos at bay. He managed the Korean War with quiet ruthlessness, negotiating an armistice that stopped the bleeding but left the peninsula divided, a wound that still festers today. He balanced the federal budget 3 times, even while launching massive infrastructure projects like the interstate highway system, a network that would bind the sprawling American continent together in asphalt and ambition. He strengthened Social Security, expanded the New Deal safety net, but resisted calls for massive government intervention in every facet of life. He believed that prosperity wasn't built in the halls of Washington, but in the factories, farms, and living rooms of ordinary Americans. And Americans, weary of depression and war, responded with gratitude and complacency. The 1950s are often remembered as a golden age of American innocence, the suburbs blooming, the middle class rising, the stars and stripes snapping proudly against blue summer skies. But under the surface, storm clouds gathered. The civil rights movement was beginning to rise, challenging the brutal realities of segregation that prosperity had politely ignored. The Cold War deepened, mutating into a permanent state of existential dread. Bomb shelters, duck and cover drills, a race for rockets and missiles. Eisenhower, with his deep mistrust of extremism, tried to steer a middle course. He sent federal troops to enforce school desegregation in Little Rock, Arkansas, grudgingly, cautiously, only when he believed the Constitution itself was under threat. He signed the first Civil Rights Act since Reconstruction, but it was weak, diluted, and largely symbolic. When history demanded a trumpet, Eisenhower often delivered a cautious clarinet. His greatest strength, his steadiness, was also sometimes his greatest flaw. He saw politics as the art of quiet management, not moral crusade, and while that kept the country stable, it also delayed justice for millions who could not afford to wait. Internationally, Eisenhower walked the razor's edge of nuclear brinkmanship. He approved covert operations, coups in Iran and Guatemala, that toppled governments deemed unfriendly to American interests. It kept the Soviet threat contained. It also sowed the seeds of decades of resentment and instability. Turns out people don't love it when your stability involves kicking over their governments like sandcastles. In private, Eisenhower raged against the military-industrial complex he saw growing fat on fear and profit. In public, he played the grandfatherly figure, allowing the myth of American invincibility to flourish, even as he knew how fragile it all was. On January 17, 1961, in his farewell address, Eisenhower issued one final warning. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence by the military-industrial complex. It was a prophetic alarm bell, one that would be ignored almost immediately as America plunged deeper into Vietnam, deeper into proxy wars, deeper into a national addiction to power disguised as security. But Eisenhower's true legacy isn't measured in wars avoided or battles won. It's measured in the stability he preserved, the quiet spaces he carved out where America could breathe, grow, stumble, and dream. He left office popular, respected, even beloved. He retired to Gettysburg, tending to his farm, painting, writing memoirs. When he died in 1969, it was like the last chapter closing on an era of quiet, square-jawed confidence. Eisenhower was not a visionary. He was not a revolutionary. He was something rarer. A man who understood that leadership is not about constant movement, but about knowing when to stand still and when to let others race ahead. He kept the chaos at bay, even as it scratched at the door. And for a time, at least, that was enough. But America, restless as always, would not remain content with stability for long. It would hunger again for movement, for feeling, for a new kind of myth to believe in. A myth built not from dusty farms or quiet strength, but from the glittering promises of Hollywood and the booming echoes of speeches that made you believe, even when you knew better. Ronald Reagan, long before he stood in the shadow of the Capitol dome, Ronald Reagan stood under the hot, fake sun of a Hollywood soundstage, flashing that easy, weaponized smile that could make millions of Americans feel like everything somehow might just turn out all right. He was born in 1911 in tiny Tampico, Illinois, to a struggling alcoholic father and a devout, optimistic mother. It was a childhood of dust, of secondhand shoes and rented apartments, of scrabbling for dignity in a country where opportunity could be as thin as the worn soles of your shoes. But Reagan learned early the secret that would carry him through a bewildering, astonishing life. Reality is negotiable if you know how to tell a better story. He became a lifeguard, saving 77 swimmers from drowning one endless summer after another. He became a radio announcer, painting vivid pictures of baseball games he couldn't see, inventing excitement out of static. And then inevitably, he became an actor. Hollywood embraced Reagan not as a star, but as a steady presence, a friendly face you could trust to deliver his lines, flash his grin, and ride off into the sunset at just the right moment. He wasn't a great actor, but he was a spectacular believer in the script, in the dream, in himself. By the 1940s, Reagan was starring in war films, training videos, second-tier dramas. When World War II broke out, poor eyesight kept him from combat, but he served stateside, making morale films for the military. He rose to the presidency of the Screen Actors Guild, battling communist influence in Hollywood with a fervor that would later define his political brand. By the 1950s, his acting career was fading, but Reagan, ever the pragmatist, shifted seamlessly into television, hosting General Electric Theater and touring the country, giving sunny speeches about American greatness in company towns and union halls. Along the way, his politics hardened. A New Deal Democrat in his youth, Reagan grew increasingly alarmed by what he saw as government overreach, the bloating of federal programs, the creeping specter of socialism in the land of the free. By the early 1960s, Ronald Reagan had found a new stage and a new role. In 1964, he delivered a televised speech supporting Republican candidate Barry Goldwater. A Time for Choosing, it was called, and it transformed Reagan from a washed-up actor into a rising conservative star. In 1966, he ran for governor of California and won by a landslide. The man who had once delivered lines written by others now wrote his own. Law and order, lower taxes, tough on protesters. He clashed with the University of California system. He cut welfare benefits. He governed not by intellectual heavy lifting, but by gut instinct and a deep, almost mystical faith in American individualism. The elites sneered. The people applauded. By the time he ran for president in 1980, America was battered and staggering. The 1970s had been a slow-motion nightmare. Vietnam, Watergate, stagflation, the Iran hostage crisis, a crisis of confidence so profound that it wasn't clear whether America even believed in itself anymore. Reagan believed, with a few simple, devastating words, "Are you better off than you were 4 years ago?" He captured the aching hunger of a country that wanted to feel strong again. He crushed incumbent Jimmy Carter in the 1980 election, sweeping into office on a wave of hope, fear, anger, and longing. And once again, Ronald Reagan became something greater than himself. He became a symbol. He called America a shining city on a hill, a phrase borrowed from Puritan sermons, polished into patriotic myth. He slashed taxes with the Economic Recovery Tax Act of 1981, promising that wealth at the top would trickle down like champagne over a pyramid of crystal glasses. He deregulated industries. He broke the Air Traffic Controllers Union in a dramatic, high-stakes standoff that sent an unmistakable message. In Reagan's America, discipline would be restored. And for a while, it seemed to work. The economy recovered, inflation cooled, jobs returned, the stock market boomed, optimism returned, scripted in golden hour light, scored by swelling orchestral music. But the story was never as simple as the commercials made it seem. While Wall Street soared, the homeless population exploded, inner cities rotted, factories closed, the wealth gap widened into a canyon. The national debt, once a conservative nightmare, ballooned to unprecedented levels, and Reagan's tax cuts, paired with massive increases in military spending, turned fiscal prudence into a relic of the past. Turns out, trickle-down economics sometimes works about as well as expecting the Titanic's first-class passengers to share the lifeboats. Yet Reagan's power wasn't in the fine print. It was in the myth. He restored a feeling that America could be strong, proud, unapologetic, that the past was a golden place and the future could be too, if only we remembered who we were. On the world stage, Reagan played the role of the resolute cowboy. He built up the military to levels unseen since World War II. He called the Soviet Union an evil empire. a phrase that sent diplomats into conniptions and conservatives into raptures. He survived an assassination attempt just months into his first term, joking with surgeons, "Please tell me you're all Republicans." He invaded Grenada, a tiny island nation most Americans couldn't find on a map, because he believed communism had to be checked wherever it appeared, no matter how small the stage. And, critically, he forged a relationship with Mikhail Gorbachev, the Soviet leader willing to admit that his own empire was crumbling under its own weight. Reagan's mix of confrontation and negotiation, threatening to build a Star Wars missile defense system while offering arms control treaties, helped push the Cold War toward its anticlimactic, glorious end. By the time the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, Reagan was out of office, but his fingerprints were all over the rubble. He left the presidency with soaring approval ratings and the kind of mythic status usually reserved for founding fathers and war heroes. And yet, Reagan's legacy, like the man himself, was a dazzling mask, hiding profound complexities. Under his watch, the AIDS epidemic ravaged communities while his administration largely looked the other way. The Iran-Contra scandal revealed illegal arms deals and shadowy operations that violated every principle of transparent governance. He expanded the size and scope of the federal government, even as he preached small government. He gave America hope and left behind ticking financial time bombs that would echo for generations. He spoke often of patriotism, faith, and family, but presided over an era that hollowed out much of the economic security that had once made the American dream possible. It's easier to sell the dream when you're not the one holding the foreclosure notice. In his later years, Reagan was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, a cruel, ironic end for a man whose greatest weapon had always been his ability to remember the best version of America. He faded from public life, his final words written with the same gentle optimism that had marked his career. "I now begin the journey that will lead me into the sunset of my life." When Ronald Reagan died in 2004, America mourned him with a national funeral filled with pomp, pride, and nostalgia. He had not healed all wounds. He had not saved all dreams, but he had given America something it needed desperately: the permission to believe in itself again, even when it hadn't fully earned it. He reminded the country that optimism itself could be a kind of rebellion, a defiant refusal to surrender to cynicism, despair, or decline. And sometimes when the night is darkest, that kind of rebellion is the only thing that keeps the flame alive. But belief alone cannot build the future. And after Reagan's era of sunny myths, America would need a new kind of hero, a man who faced the cold calculus of realpolitik with a grin, a war wound, and a Boston accent. John F. Kennedy. Kennedy was not supposed to be a hero. He was supposed to be the spare, the second son in a sprawling, ambitious dynasty where greatness had already been earmarked for his older brother, Joe. Jack, as his family called him, was the sickly one, the fragile boy with the charming smile and the hollow bones, the one who spent more time in hospital beds than on ball fields, his body a fragile shell barely keeping pace with the brilliant, restless mind trapped inside it. But fate, as it often does, rewrote the script. When Joe Jr. was killed during a secret bombing mission in World War II, the Kennedy family's hopes and burdens shifted onto Jack's narrow shoulders. The golden boy was gone. The backup had become the heir, and somehow, impossibly, the heir rose to meet history's impossible demands. Kennedy was born in 1917 in Brookline, Massachusetts, into a family that believed in two things above all else: power and public service. Joseph Kennedy, the family patriarch, had clawed his way up from Irish Catholic obscurity into the smoky backrooms of American wealth and politics. Jack absorbed it all: the ambition, the entitlement, the sense that rules were things other people had to worry about. But he also developed a wry, sardonic wit, a fatalistic sense of humor about the absurdities of life that would later become one of his most disarming weapons. Educated at Harvard, polished in London as the son of an ambassador, Jack Kennedy came of age just as the world collapsed into war. Despite his fragile health, he joined the Navy, pulling strings if necessary, refusing to sit out history's defining struggle. In 1943, his patrol boat, PT-109, was rammed by a Japanese destroyer in the black waters of the Solomon Islands. In the chaos that followed, Kennedy's back was broken again. He dragged injured crewmates through shark-infested waters, towing one by a life jacket strap clenched between his teeth. They survived. Barely. The episode would become the cornerstone of Kennedy's myth, a reminder that beneath the effortless grin was a man forged by pain, fear, and relentless endurance. After the war, Kennedy turned to politics, as if answering some ancient call written in the Kennedy blood. Congress in 1946, the Senate in 1952, each victory earned not just by name and money, but by an almost pathological need to prove that he was more than just a pretty face in a well-cut suit. He won the presidency in 1960 by the slimmest of margins, defeating Richard Nixon after a brutal campaign defined by televised debates that finally proved politics would never again be just about words. It would be about images, about feelings, about presence. Kennedy radiated vitality, youth, hope, possibility. He spoke of a new frontier, of conquering poverty, disease, tyranny, and even space itself. Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country. It wasn't just rhetoric. It was a dare, and for a brief, electric moment, America accepted it. Camelot, they called it later, a time of shining possibility, of art and intellect and heroism reborn. But like all myths, the truth underneath was more complicated. Kennedy's presidency began with disaster, the Bay of Pigs fiasco in 1961, a botched, CIA-backed invasion of Cuba that ended with American-supported exiles dead or captured, and America's reputation battered. Kennedy had inherited the plan from Eisenhower's administration, but he had signed off on it, trusting experts who assured him it would succeed. It didn't. And the lesson he learned was brutal and essential. Trust, but verify, and always, always question the experts. Later that year, when Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev tested him at the Vienna summit, bullying and berating the young president, Kennedy came away grim-faced and furious, privately admitting that Khrushchev beat the hell out of me. It was a humiliation he would not forget, and it nearly pushed the world to the brink of annihilation. In October 1962, American spy planes discovered Soviet missiles being installed in Cuba. Thus began the Cuban Missile Crisis, 13 days when the world held its breath, perched on the edge of thermonuclear war. Kennedy's advisors, many of them veterans of the Pentagon's Iron School of Thought, urged immediate, devastating airstrikes. Kennedy hesitated. He doubted. He listened and then decided to blockade Cuba instead, buying time, searching for a way out. Through back-channel negotiations, secret concessions, and nerves of steel, Kennedy navigated the tightrope. The missiles were removed. Nuclear war was avoided, barely. The crisis transformed Kennedy. The brash young president became a hardened realist, not cynical, but sober. He saw power for what it truly was, a monstrous, barely contained force that could only be wielded with humility and terror in equal measure. Domestically, Kennedy's record was mixed. He spoke stirringly about civil rights, but moved cautiously, afraid of alienating the Southern Democrats who still held the keys to legislative power. When freedom riders were beaten and fire hoses blasted children in Birmingham, Kennedy hesitated, calculating the political cost. Only when it became unavoidable, only when the images of brutality flooded American living rooms, did he finally throw the weight of the presidency behind civil rights in a full-throated way. In June 1963, he delivered a speech that still echoes across decades. We are confronted primarily with a moral issue. It is as old as the scriptures and as clear as the American Constitution. It was a beginning, not a triumph, but it mattered. And so did Kennedy's vision for America's future. He didn't just dream of putting a man on the moon. He made it a national mission. In an age of Soviet rockets and nuclear fear, Kennedy offered space as a place not of terror, but of hope. We choose to go to the moon, not because it is easy, but because it is hard, risky, difficult. It was a call to greatness not through comfort, but through challenge. And America, once again, believed. Kennedy's flaws remained. He was reckless in his personal life, juggling affairs with an ease and arrogance that would, in a later era, have annihilated his career. He tolerated shady political alliances, winked at mob connections, played fast and loose with the mechanisms of secrecy and loyalty. He was mortal, fallible, human, and then, in November 1963, he was gone. A bullet, a motorcade, a stunned, grieving widow, A nation plunged into mourning so profound that it seemed for a moment as if time itself had cracked open. The official story would tell of a lone gunman. The unofficial stories, conspiracies of the CIA, the Mafia, the Soviets, the Cubans, would multiply endlessly because the truth was too unbearable to be so small. How could so much promise end in a flash of gunfire from a window? It couldn't. It shouldn't. So Americans kept rewriting it, trying to make the ending bigger, worthy of the dream. But Kennedy's true legacy isn't in the myths. It's in the lingering, aching question he left behind. What if? What if the new frontier had fully unfolded? What if civil rights had moved faster? What if Vietnam had never become a quagmire? What if America had learned to live up to the challenges Kennedy had dared it to face? He didn't live long enough to see the answers. But maybe, deep down, he knew. Maybe the real job of a president isn't to finish the work. Maybe it's to start it, to light the fire, knowing you won't see the end, but trusting that the light will carry forward. John F. Kennedy lit that fire, and if the world still carries a little of that flame today, it's because somewhere, deep inside, we still believe that hard things are worth doing, even when they break your heart. But before Kennedy dared America to reach for the stars, another man had dared it to reshape the very rules of war, peace, and empire. A man whose dreams of idealism collapsed under the brutal weight of history, and whose contradictions would still echo into the blood-soaked trenches of a world at war. Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson believed in dreams, the kind of dreams that could rewrite the world. He just didn't always believe in the people who lived in it. Born in 1856 in the quiet town of Staunton, Virginia, Wilson was a child of war and Reconstruction, his earliest memories imprinted with the thunder of cannons and the slow humiliation of the South's defeat. He grew up in a world cracked down the middle by ideology, where ideas mattered more than oxygen, and righteousness was a weapon sharper than any blade. It shaped him into a scholar before it shaped him into a leader, a thinker before a doer. Wilson climbed the heights of academia with single-minded intensity, studying law, history, and government, not as dry subjects, but as the sacred architecture of civilization itself. He earned his doctorate, the first and only U.S. president to do so, and eventually rose to the presidency of Princeton University, where he remade the college into a powerhouse of intellectual rigor and modern curriculum. But for all his devotion to reason, Wilson carried a romantic heart, one that beat not for the messy compromises of daily life, but for the shining, unreachable ideal of what life ought to be. It was both his greatest strength and the flaw that would crack him open. In 1910, Woodrow Wilson entered politics, running for governor of New Jersey. He ran as a progressive reformer and won. 2 years later, riding a tidal wave of dissatisfaction with corporate corruption and political machine rot, he won the presidency in 1912, defeating not just Republican incumbent William Howard Taft, but also the insurgent third-party bid of Theodore Roosevelt. Wilson came to the White House with the air of a prophet rather than a politician. He spoke of a new freedom, of tearing down the thrones of business monopolies, banking cartels, and political machines. He promised a government that would not just referee the market, but liberate it, and for a while it worked. Wilson oversaw an extraordinary burst of reform. He signed the Federal Reserve Act, reshaping American finance for a new century. He pushed through the Clayton Antitrust Act, giving teeth to the fight against corporate monopolies. He lowered tariffs, making competition fairer and products cheaper. He presided over the creation of the Federal Trade Commission. He championed labor rights, including the 8-hour workday for railroad workers. In just 4 years, he dragged a reluctant Congress into the modern age of regulatory government, one where the state served not just the rich or the powerful, but the ordinary citizen battered by forces too big to fight alone. It was breathtaking. It was inspiring. It was only the beginning, because across the Atlantic, a storm was brewing. When World War I erupted in Europe in 1914, Wilson pledged neutrality. America must be impartial in thought as well as action, he declared. He meant it, or wanted to, but neutrality proved impossible. German U-boats stalked the Atlantic, sinking ships and drowning civilians. British propaganda flooded American newspapers, stirring outrage. Wall Street bankers lined up behind the Allies, linking American fortunes to Allied victory. And then in 1917, the final straw. Germany resumed unrestricted submarine warfare and tried to recruit Mexico to attack the United States through the infamous Zimmerman telegram. Wilson, the reluctant warrior, asked Congress for a declaration of war. "The world must be made safe for democracy," he said. It was a phrase destined for history books. And bitter irony, America entered the war not just as a military power, but as a crusader, bearing Wilson's dream of a better world stitched onto its banners. For a while, it looked like it might even come true. American troops poured into Europe, tipping the balance against Germany. The Allies won, and Wilson, arriving in Paris in 1919, carried with him a vision for the post-war world that was nothing short of revolutionary. A League of Nations, self-determination for oppressed peoples, a global system where disputes were settled by law, not blood. He believed with a kind of luminous, heartbreaking faith that the war could be the last war, that humanity could finally rise above its primal lust for conquest and vengeance. He pushed, bullied, pleaded, and bargained with the other Allied leaders, carving the Treaty of Versailles into a rough sketch of his ideals. But Wilson had underestimated something fatal, the limits of human nature and of American patience. Back home, the Senate, led by bitter partisans and old guard isolationists, rebelled against the League of Nations. They saw entangling alliances, loss of sovereignty, endless foreign wars. They refused to ratify the treaty. Wilson, heartbroken and furious, embarked on a grueling cross-country speaking tour to rally public support. His health, already precarious, collapsed under the strain. In October 1919, he suffered a massive stroke that left him partially paralyzed and mentally diminished. For months, the United States effectively had no functioning president. His wife, Edith Wilson, managed access to him, shielding his incapacity from the public. It was a constitutional crisis hidden behind lace curtains. Wilson never fully recovered. He spent his final years a shadow of the man who had once dreamed of saving the world with pen and principle. When he left office in 1921, the country turned away from his ideals, embracing isolationism, nationalism, and the easy forgetfulness of the Jazz Age. Woodrow Wilson died 3 years later, largely forgotten and largely reviled. He left behind a legacy so tangled it still defies clean judgment. He had championed democracy and presided over brutal suppression of dissent during the war. He had fought for self-determination abroad and resegregated the federal government at home, reversing decades of slow racial progress. He had preached global justice and signed a treaty that sowed the seeds of World War II. He had dreamed of a better world and helped build a world still cracked by injustice, still haunted by the very demons he tried to banish. Apparently, dreaming big doesn't guarantee you'll wake up in the world you wanted, yet Wilson's essential greatness and his essential tragedy remain entwined. He dared to believe that human beings could transcend their worst instincts. He dared to try, and though he failed spectacularly, painfully, humanly, he left behind something precious, a blueprint, an idea, a whisper through history that the world we have is not the world we must accept, that sometimes, even in defeat, the dream itself matters, because dreams, once spoken aloud, have a way of lingering long after their dreamers are gone. But after the idealists fall, history often demands a different kind of warrior, a man willing to get his hands dirty, to build kingdoms and break them, to fight battles in Congress as bloody as any fought on foreign shores. Lyndon B. Johnson, Lyndon Baines. Johnson didn't come to Washington to play by the rules. He came to rewrite them or bulldoze them, whichever got him there faster. Born in 1908 in a cabin in the Texas Hill Country, Johnson grew up in the long shadows of poverty and ambition. His father, once a prosperous state legislator, lost almost everything in a bad cotton deal. His mother, fiercely intelligent, instilled in him the brutal understanding that talent meant nothing without power. Lyndon learned early that you didn't just ask for opportunity, you grabbed it by the throat. He towered over his classmates, physically and otherwise, commanding every room he entered with a mix of relentless charm, intimidation, and raw, blinding energy. If he couldn't outthink you, he would outwork you. If he couldn't outwork you, he would outflank you. And if none of that worked, he would smile, until you realized too late that the knife was already in. Johnson came to Washington in 1931 as a congressional aide, absorbing the backroom language of favors and threats like a second mother tongue. He served as a New Deal foot soldier under FDR, wrapping himself in the language of progressivism while honing the art of survival. Elected to Congress himself in 1937, he rose through the ranks with dizzying speed, fueled by a combination of strategic alliances, brutal loyalty demands, and a nose for weakness so finely tuned it could smell fear across a state line. By the 1950s, he was Senate Majority Leader, the most powerful man in Congress, and the undisputed master of what he called the Johnson treatment. It was legendary, a full-body assault of flattery, bullying, seduction, and threat, delivered inches from your face with a force that could melt steel. Imagine a tornado wearing a $500 suit and smelling faintly of Marlboros. By the time John F. Kennedy tapped him as his running mate in 1960, Johnson was a giant, resented, feared, indispensable. When Kennedy was assassinated in November 1963, Johnson was sworn in aboard Air Force One, his face a mask of grief, shock, and calculation. He inherited not just the presidency, but the unfulfilled promises of the new frontier, and he intended to make them real by any means necessary. Johnson launched the Great Society, a sweeping agenda aimed at eradicating poverty, promoting education, expanding civil rights, and building a safety net big enough to catch every American who stumbled. Medicare and Medicaid, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, Head Start, public broadcasting, urban renewal. Piece by piece, Johnson reshaped American life more profoundly and permanently than any president since Franklin D. Roosevelt. He wielded the machinery of government like a conductor leading an orchestra, sometimes inspiring, sometimes bludgeoning, always moving. And for a moment it worked. Poverty rates fell. Education access soared. Hospitals opened their doors to those who had been shut out by generations of neglect. Johnson didn't just dream of a better America. He built it, but he built it on fault lines he could not see or refused to acknowledge. Because even as he crafted the Great Society, Johnson escalated another war half a world away. Vietnam. At first it was a whisper, a few thousand advisors. Then came the Gulf of Tonkin incident, murky, disputed, and the blank check from Congress that followed. Johnson, terrified of appearing weak against communism, began pouring American lives and dollars into the jungles of Southeast Asia. Each escalation was framed as necessary, inevitable, unavoidable. Each lie was told for what Johnson convinced himself was a good cause, preserving American credibility, protecting democracy. But the lies metastasized. Body counts replaced victory conditions. Villages burned in the name of liberation. Television brought the horror into American living rooms night after night. And slowly, the towering achievement of the Great Society began to collapse under the unbearable weight of the body bags arriving from Saigon and Hue and Khe Sanh. Protests erupted. Cities burned. The country tore itself apart along every seam Johnson had once dreamed of stitching together. He was a man trapped between two Americas, one he had helped to lift up and one he was dragging into the graveyard of empire. The irony was almost too bitter to swallow. Lyndon Johnson, who had done more for racial equality than any president before or since, was reviled by the very movement he had championed. Lyndon Johnson, who had fought to give voice to the poor and the marginalized, was drowned out by the roar of a nation that no longer trusted any voice from Washington. In 1968, facing mounting opposition, collapsing approval ratings, and a soul hollowed out by grief and guilt, Johnson stunned the nation. I shall not seek, and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president. It was not surrender. It was retreat. A battered general limping off a battlefield strewn with the wreckage of dreams he could no longer command. He retired to his Texas ranch, a ghost of the man who had once roared through the Senate like a human earthquake. He watched from afar as the Democratic Party he had tried to hold together fractured irreparably. He watched as Richard Nixon took the White House, promising law and order to a country Johnson had tried and failed to redeem through justice and compassion. Lyndon B. Johnson died in 1973, just days after Nixon announced the end of American involvement in Vietnam. Heart failure, the doctors said. But maybe it wasn't just the heart that failed. Maybe it was the idea that one man, no matter how powerful, could outwit history's merciless contradictions, because Lyndon Johnson's greatness and his tragedy were one and the same. He believed fiercely, stubbornly, foolishly, that government could be a force for good, that it could lift the fallen, protect the vulnerable, and perfect the Union. And he also believed, equally fiercely, that the ends justified the means, that power could be bent toward virtue without corroding the soul. He was wrong, and he was right, and he proved both at once. Johnson's legacy is a house built on bedrock and blood, a country that votes more freely because of him, that heals more often because of him, that educates more children and cares for more elderly because of him, and a country that still grapples with the cost of believing that war can be waged without losing pieces of your soul along the way. He dreamed of greatness, he achieved it, and it nearly destroyed him, because in the end, even the greatest builder cannot control the storm. But before America grappled with its darker angels, there had been a time of simpler dreams, a time when a young nation, barely out of infancy, looked to a leader who promised unity without empire, strength without tyranny, James Monroe. Before the world became complicated, before the American dream started to bleed at the edges, there was James Monroe, the last founding father to stand at the nation's helm, the last man who could remember when America was an idea written on parchment rather than a sprawling, conflicted empire, the last living echo of a revolution that still smelled of gunpowder and possibility. Monroe was born in 1758 in the Tidewater wilds of Virginia, a place where revolution wasn't a philosophical debate. It was a looming, bloody certainty. At 17, Monroe dropped out of college to join the Continental Army because when your world is on fire, you don't sit in lecture halls. He fought under George Washington at the Battle of Trenton, where he took a musket ball to the shoulder that nearly killed him and marked him forever as a son of the Revolution, baptized by blood. After the war, like many of his generation, Monroe straddled two worlds: the messy, corrupt world of politics and the gleaming ideal of a republic yet to be built. He studied law under Thomas Jefferson, absorbing not just legal principles, but a vision of government rooted in liberty, skepticism of power, and a fierce belief that the future belonged to the bold. Monroe served as a senator, as governor of Virginia, and as a diplomat in France during the seething chaos of the French Revolution, a nightmare Jefferson had once idealized, but Monroe witnessed firsthand with guillotines clattering in the streets. He was a steady, plodding public servant, not the most brilliant man of his age, not the most eloquent, but reliable, honorable, and above all, persistent. He lived through the contradictions of early American life, the soaring rhetoric of freedom side by side with the grim, grinding realities of slavery, inequality, and division. And he believed, perhaps naively, that the American experiment could somehow grow past its sins without being consumed by them. When James Madison's presidency ended in 1817, Monroe was the obvious choice to succeed him. He won the election easily, and with his ascension, America entered what history would call the era of good feelings. It sounded better than it really was. On the surface, Monroe's America seemed almost miraculously unified. The bitter political divisions between Federalists and Democratic Republicans had cooled. Economic growth flourished. The country expanded westward with a kind of breathless inevitability. But underneath the smiles and celebrations, old tensions festered. Regional rivalries sharpened. Economic inequalities widened. The issue of slavery, long papered over by compromise and wishful thinking, lurked like a live wire waiting for a spark. Monroe, ever the pragmatist, tried to hold it all together. He toured the country, visiting every state, the first president to do so since George Washington, in an effort to physically embody the unity he so desperately wanted to believe in. And for a while, it worked. His administration oversaw major achievements. The acquisition of Florida from Spain, negotiated through the Adams-Honest Treaty, securing America's southern border, the Missouri Compromise of 1820, temporarily defusing the explosive question of whether slavery would expand into new territories. And, most famously, the Monroe Doctrine, a bold declaration that the Western Hemisphere was off-limits to future European colonization. On paper, the Monroe Doctrine was a stunning assertion of American influence, an act of geopolitical chest-thumping from a country still barely able to defend its own borders. In reality, it was a bluff. enforced not by American power, but by the British Navy, which was far more interested in keeping European rivals out of the Americas than in helping its former colonies flex their muscles. Nothing says bold independence like having someone else back your threats, but Monroe understood the game. He knew that perception could become reality if you played your cards with enough conviction, and he believed above all else that America had the right and the destiny to shape its own sphere of influence, free from the meddling of the old world. Yet even as Monroe planted the seeds of American greatness, he also planted seeds of crisis. The Missouri Compromise, which admitted Missouri as a slave state and Maine as a free state to preserve the balance of power, only postponed the inevitable reckoning over slavery. It drew a literal line across the country, 36 degrees, 30 minutes latitude, above which slavery was banned and below which it was permitted. It was a compromise born of fear, not principle. A silent admission that the dream of a united republic was already splitting at the seams. Monroe, true to form, treated it as a necessary evil, a way to keep the fragile union intact a little longer. He didn't solve the problem. He didn't try. He simply handed it off to future generations like a cursed inheritance. In 1820, Monroe ran for re-election virtually unopposed, carrying every electoral vote but one, a political triumph so complete that it would never be repeated. He left office in 1825, a tired but respected figure, slipping into the quiet obscurity he had always preferred to the brutal theater of political life. But the America he left behind was not the America he had imagined. The economy would soon collapse in the panic of 1819, sowing bitterness and rebellion among farmers and working men. The false unity of the era of good feelings would shatter into vicious sectionalism, culminating decades later in the bloodbath of civil war. Monroe's dream of a strong, united republic would be tested to the breaking point and found wanting. Still, Monroe gave America something precious, even if it was imperfect: time. He bought the young republic a few more decades to grow, to stumble, to forge an identity that might someday be strong enough to survive the reckoning he knew was coming. He embodied a kind of quiet greatness, the greatness of endurance, of patience, of believing that even a deeply flawed country could stagger forward toward something better. James Monroe died on July 4th, 1831, fittingly on the anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. He was the third president in a row to die on the 4th of July, a strange, eerie echo of the revolution that had birthed them. His death passed with little fanfare. By then, he was already more myth than man, a half-remembered symbol of simpler times that had never really been simple. But Monroe's legacy remains stitched into the DNA of American ambition, the belief that this hemisphere belongs to its own people, the belief that compromise, however painful, is sometimes the only way to survive, the belief that greatness, real greatness, requires patience and sacrifice, not just passion. He was not a firebrand, not a conqueror, not a philosopher. He was a builder, a bricklayer of the Republic. And if the edifice he helped construct was cracked and leaning, he trusted that future hands would find a way to shore it up. Maybe that's all any generation can ask for. Maybe it's enough, but survival is never enough for long. Soon America would hunger not just to endure, but to conquer, to expand, to stretch its young sinews across a continent and bend destiny itself to its will. James K. Polk. If greatness were measured by ambition fulfilled, James K. Polk would sit atop Mount Rushmore, staring down at history with a smirk. Instead, he's barely a footnote in most textbooks, a name murmured in passing, an asterisk in the story of America's relentless march west, which is exactly the way he planned it. Polk was born in 1795 in the raw frontier of North Carolina, a land where civilization was a thin veneer stretched over mud, grit, and gunpowder. His family moved west to Tennessee when he was a boy, carving out farms from the tangled woods and raising their sons on stories of self-reliance and restless ambition. Polk was not a man built for the backwoods. Sickly as a child, undergoing surgery without anesthesia at 17, he was marked early by a combination of frailty and fury, a deep, burning need to prove that he could master the chaos that had nearly killed him. He attended the University of North Carolina, where he distinguished himself not by brilliance, but by sheer, unrelenting grind. That would become the defining pattern of his life. Polk was not flashy. He was not charismatic. He was a man who picked a goal, lowered his head, and plowed toward it like a bull through a cornfield. He studied law, entered politics, and by 1825, he was elected to Congress, rising quickly under the mentorship of another Tennessee Titan, Andrew Jackson. Polk worshipped Jackson, not the kindly father figure kind of worship, but the ruthless, blood and thunder loyalty that Jackson inspired in those who understood that power was not given, it was taken. He earned the nickname Young Hickory, a tribute to Jackson's old hickory toughness. And he earned another reputation too, a man who kept his promises. In 1835, Polk became Speaker of the House, the first and only president ever to have held that position first. He wielded the gavel not as an impartial arbiter, but as a weapon, smashing opposition, forcing votes, twisting arms. He was a master of parliamentary warfare, a king in a kingdom of procedure and patience. Later, as governor of Tennessee, Polk's ambitions tilted higher, but with greater risks. He lost his re-election bid, then he lost again. By 1844, Polk's political career seemed to be sinking into the muddy graveyard of once promising men. But fate and chaos had other plans. The Democratic National Convention that year deadlocked between powerful factions. Enter Polk, the dark horse candidate, the compromise choice no one hated quite enough to block. He won the nomination. And then, stunningly, he won the presidency, defeating Henry Clay, one of the most famous politicians of the age. Polk entered the White House with a clarity of purpose almost unparalleled in American history. He laid out 4 goals: settle the dispute over the Oregon Territory, annex California, lower tariffs, create an independent treasury. 4 goals, 4 years, 1 shot. Polk didn't intend to be loved. He intended to be effective. And he was. In his first year, he slashed tariffs with the Walker Tariff Act, strengthening American manufacturing while undercutting British goods. He reestablished the independent treasury system, separating government funds from private banks, a move designed to prevent another financial collapse like the Panic of 1837. But it was his foreign policy, the way he bent maps and borders to his will, that would define his legacy. Polk believed in manifest destiny, the conviction that America was ordained to expand from the Atlantic to the Pacific. He believed it not as a dreamy abstraction, but as a bloody, grinding inevitability. He negotiated with Britain over the Oregon Territory, threatening war, but ultimately settling on the 49th parallel as the northern boundary. It was a diplomatic victory, won without a shot fired. But the real flashpoint was Texas, and everything that lay beyond it. Texas had been annexed shortly before Polk took office, infuriating Mexico, which refused to recognize the loss of its former province. Polk, eager to expand further, sent American troops into the disputed zone between the Nueces River and the Rio Grande. When Mexican forces fired on American soldiers, Polk seized the moment. American blood has been shed on American soil, he declared, and Congress, whipped into patriotic fervor, declared war. It was a neat, cynical maneuver. Manufactured outrage, masking naked ambition. The Mexican-American War was brutal, bloody, and lopsided. American forces, led by generals like Winfield Scott and Zachary Taylor, smashed Mexican resistance, capturing Mexico City itself. In the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, Polk achieved his dream. The United States gained vast swaths of territory. What would become California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, and parts of Colorado and Wyoming. It was a land grab on a scale so staggering it reshaped not just maps, but the future. It completed America's continental expansion. It fulfilled manifest destiny, and it poured gasoline on every division simmering beneath the surface. Because with the new territories came a terrible looming question. Would slavery expand westward too? Polk, a slaveholder himself, sidestepped the moral catastrophe he helped create. He focused on the spoils. He left the consequences to others. Nothing says visionary leadership quite like kicking a time bomb down the road and hoping you're out of office when it goes off. Polk served exactly 1 term as he had promised. He entered office with a plan. He executed it with ruthless efficiency. And then, having spent every ounce of his considerable energy, he walked away. He left the White House exhausted, aged beyond his years, his health failing. He died just 3 months later, at the age of 53. History barely paused to note his passing. No grand monuments, no marble memorials, just a thin, fading echo of a man who had changed the shape of a continent and then disappeared into the dust. Polk was not a visionary like Jefferson. He was not a poet like Lincoln. He was a machine, a relentless, grinding force of will. He delivered what he promised. He expanded the United States by over 1 million square miles. He set the stage for economic growth, for westward migration, for the rise of America as a continental power. And he also set the stage for the bloodiest conflict in American history, a war over the soul of the nation he had helped to build. James K. Polk reminds us that greatness is not always noble. Sometimes it's sharp-edged, transactional, and soaked in consequences no one wants to admit. He was a president who measured success by deeds, not dreams. And by that standard, he was one of the most successful leaders America has ever known. The tragedy is that he was also one of the most short-sighted, because expansion without unity is not growth. It's an invitation to disaster, and disaster was already sharpening its knives. But before the storm could break, America would find itself led by a different kind of builder, a man who believed that prosperity was peace, and that industry could bind a divided nation back together. William McKinley. William McKinley was the last president of an old America, and the reluctant midwife of a new one. He didn't march into history waving a sword or preaching revolution. He simply stepped onto the stage at the exact moment the country decided it was too big, too rich, and too restless to stay home any longer. He was born in 1843 in Niles, Ohio, into a working-class family that believed in God, country, and the grinding dignity of honest work. He wasn't a prodigy. He wasn't a golden boy. He was simply steady. Steady enough to enlist in the Union Army at 18 when the Civil War tore the country apart. Steady enough to fight at Antietam, one of the bloodiest battles in American history, where he bravely delivered food and supplies to soldiers under fire. Steady enough to climb the ranks from private to brevet major, a title he carried proudly for the rest of his life. After the war, McKinley studied law, entered politics, and spent the next 3 decades navigating the grubby, transactional world of Ohio republicanism. He wasn't a reformer like Theodore Roosevelt. He wasn't a visionary like Abraham Lincoln. He was a coalition builder, a patient architect of compromise. He served in Congress for 14 years, specializing in tariffs, those dry, soul-crushing battlegrounds where the future of American industry and labor was being quietly decided. He believed that high tariffs protected American workers. He believed that prosperity wasn't a miracle. It was a machine, one that needed careful tending, constant maintenance, and occasional ruthless protection from foreign competition. By the 1890s, McKinley had become governor of Ohio, one of the most powerful political positions in the country. And by 1896, with the economy in shambles and the country boiling over with anger and fear, he became the Republican Party's standard-bearer. His opponent, William Jennings Bryan, roared through the campaign with populist thunder, preaching the gospel of silver coinage and casting the election as a holy war between the poor and the plutocrat. McKinley didn't roar. He didn't thunder. He campaigned from his front porch in Canton, Ohio, greeting delegations of voters who came to see him, calmly explaining his vision of steady, protective prosperity. Behind the scenes, his campaign manager, Mark Hanna, engineered one of the first modern political operations, raising unprecedented amounts of money, flooding the country with pamphlets, newspapers, and carefully managed appearances. Apparently, democracy has always had a subscription plan. McKinley won a decisive victory, and with it, he inherited a country teetering between worlds. The 19th century was ending, and the old American model, inward-looking, isolationist, modest in ambition, was fraying at the seams. Industrialization had transformed the economy. Cities were swelling. Immigrants were arriving by the millions. Corporations were flexing muscles stronger than most governments. And overseas, the great empires of Europe were carving up the globe like a roast at a Sunday dinner. McKinley didn't plan to join them. He believed sincerely that America's destiny was commerce, not conquest. But history, as always, had other ideas. In 1898, the USS Maine exploded in Havana Harbor under murky circumstances. killing over 260 American sailors. The yellow press screamed for war. Public opinion boiled with fury. "Remember the Maine" became the national battle cry. McKinley, cautious to the last, tried to negotiate. When that failed, he asked Congress for a declaration of war against Spain. The Spanish-American War lasted just a few months, a brief, savage, almost surreal conflict that saw American forces smash Spanish power in Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. Suddenly, the United States found itself in possession of an empire. Cuba, nominally independent but effectively controlled. Puerto Rico, Guam, the Philippines. McKinley hadn't wanted an empire, but once it was in his lap, he believed it was America's duty to uplift and civilize its new subjects, a sentiment dripping with the casual racism and paternalism of the era. Nothing says liberation quite like a few extra centuries of colonization. In the Philippines, the promise of liberation collapsed into brutal reality as Filipino revolutionaries, expecting independence, instead found themselves facing American bayonets. The Philippine-American War that followed was bloody, vicious, and largely forgotten by the same Americans who had once cheered the Spanish-American War as a noble crusade. Thousands died. American soldiers burned villages, tortured prisoners, and waded through swamps soaked in blood and betrayal. McKinley, ever the moralist, framed the conflict as tragic but necessary, the painful price of bringing civilization to those deemed incapable of achieving it alone. It was a rationalization that would echo through every future American war of liberation. At home, McKinley presided over a booming economy. Gold discoveries in Alaska stabilized the currency. New tariffs protected American industries. Factories roared. Railroads expanded. Prosperity returned. And McKinley, the quiet architect of this new industrial empire, rode a wave of popularity into a second term, with Theodore Roosevelt, the brash hero of San Juan Hill, as his new vice president. It should have been the beginning of a long, triumphant twilight. Instead, it ended in a flash of violence. On September 6th, 1901, at the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York, McKinley stood in a receiving line, shaking hands with citizens. A 28-year-old anarchist named Leon Czolgosz approached him, a pistol hidden under a handkerchief. 2 shots rang out. McKinley staggered but remained standing, murmuring to his guards, "Let no one hurt him." He was rushed to a makeshift hospital where doctors, ill-equipped and operating under conditions little improved from the Civil War, failed to find the bullet lodged inside him. For 8 agonizing days, the country waited. At first, it seemed he might recover. Then infection set in. On September 14th, McKinley died. His last words were, fittingly, an old hymn, "Nearer, my God, to thee." His death shocked the nation, and it catapulted Theodore Roosevelt, the most dynamic, unpredictable force American politics had ever seen, into the presidency. McKinley's legacy was almost immediately overshadowed. He became the quiet, tragic figure standing at the threshold of America's imperial century, a man who had believed in peace but found himself a steward of war, a man who had preached prosperity but laid the groundwork for global competition and conflict. He left behind an America that no longer saw itself as a provincial experiment, but as a rising power, a young giant stretching its arms toward the Pacific, toward Latin America, toward a future it didn't yet understand. William McKinley reminds us that history doesn't always wait for heroes to be ready. Sometimes it grabs steady hands, forces them onto the tiller, and sends them hurtling into storms they never wanted to face. He wasn't the architect of America's empire, but he opened the door. And once opened, there was no closing it. And if McKinley cracked the door open, others would one day have to reckon with what came pouring through. Decades later, in a nation again torn between hope and fear, another president would step onto a different kind of battlefield, one of race, economics, and identity, carrying with him the impossible weight of history and the fragile dreams of millions. Barack Obama. It's a strange thing, becoming a symbol before you become a man. Even stranger to know that no matter what you do, no matter what wars you end or promises you keep, you'll always be measured against a dream you didn't invent, but could never fully escape. Barack Obama was born in 1961, at the crossroads of hope and heartbreak, in a country still learning, awkwardly, violently, painfully, that liberty was a promise it hadn't yet delivered to all its children. His story didn't fit the old molds. Son of a Kenyan father and a white Kansan mother, raised in Hawaii and Indonesia, shaped by beaches and books, by cultures blending and clashing in his veins. From the beginning, Obama was an outsider everywhere, and yet somehow everywhere at home. He wasn't raised on stories of inevitability. He was raised on the stubborn, flickering faith that dreams mattered even if they broke your heart, maybe especially if they broke your heart. He climbed the ladders carefully: Columbia University, Harvard Law School, where he became the first Black president of the Harvard Law Review, community organizing on the south side of Chicago, learning that real change wasn't made by speeches, but by sweat and second chances. He wasn't a revolutionary. He wasn't a radical. He was something far more dangerous. A pragmatist who knew how to speak the language of dreams. He entered politics not as a crusader, but as a quiet storm. Illinois State Senator, United States Senator, and then, improbably, the keynote speaker at the 2004 Democratic National Convention, a single speech that crackled through the American psyche like a live wire. There is not a liberal America and a conservative America. There is the United States of America. It was a promise. It was a dare. It was a story so beautiful that, for a moment, even the cynics wanted to believe. By 2008, with the country mired in 2 endless wars, staggering under the worst economic collapse since the Great Depression, and drowning in cynicism, Barack Obama stood at the center of a storm he had neither created nor fully controlled. His message was simple and devastatingly effective. Hope, change, one word each, big enough to hold all the dreams Americans couldn't quite name anymore. He defeated Hillary Clinton in the Democratic primaries, a political machine dismantled by charisma, organization, and a campaign powered by millions of small donors and first-time voters. He faced John McCain, a war hero, in the general election, and defeated him too, riding a tidal wave of enthusiasm not seen since the days of Kennedy. On November 4th, 2008, America elected its first Black president. Crowds wept in the streets. Children watched history crack open on live television. Older generations who had once been forbidden to vote watched the impossible unfold. If there is anyone out there who still doubts that America is a place where all things are possible, Obama said that night, standing in Chicago's Grant Park, a single figure against a sea of hope. It wasn't just a political victory, it was a spiritual one. But reality, as it always does, came calling. Obama inherited a country on fire, an economy bleeding 700,000 jobs a month, banks collapsing, homes foreclosed by the thousands, 2 wars grinding on without end. And despite his soaring rhetoric, despite the "Yes, we can" posters peeling from city walls, Obama quickly discovered the limits of what even a historic presidency could achieve. He passed the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, an $800 billion stimulus aimed at stabilizing the free fall. It worked. Slowly, grudgingly, the economy began to heal. But for millions, the recovery was invisible, a whisper of better numbers while their own lives still crumbled. In 2010, he signed into law the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, a sweeping, messy, fiercely contested attempt to drag America's fractured healthcare system into the 21st century. It expanded coverage to over 20 million Americans. It banned insurance companies from denying coverage for pre-existing conditions. It attempted imperfectly to redefine healthcare, not as a luxury, but as a right. It was also a political catastrophe. The backlash was immediate and ferocious. The Tea Party movement rose, fueled by fear, resentment, and the deep, ancient American suspicion that government help always comes with hidden chains. Democrats lost the House of Representatives in a landslide in 2010. Gridlock became the new normal. Every bill became a brawl. Every appointment, a siege. Obama adjusted. He governed by executive action where legislation failed. He maneuvered, negotiated, retreated, and advanced like a chess player trapped in an endless middle game. He won victories: the Dodd-Frank Act, regulating Wall Street; the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, allowing LGBTQ plus Americans to serve openly in the military; the killing of Osama bin Laden in 2011, a quiet, surgical end to the world's most infamous fugitive. He also bore the bruises of failure: The promise to close Guantanamo Bay faded into bureaucratic quicksand. Immigration reform died on the Senate floor. Gun violence, punctuated by tragedies like Sandy Hook, remained an unsolved, gaping wound. Apparently, yes we can doesn't apply to common sense when lobbyists are paying the rent. Obama's greatest gift, his ability to inspire, was also his greatest curse. Because inspiration without transformation breeds disillusionment. By his second term, the hope that had once electrified a generation had cooled into something tougher, something sadder, resilience. Still, there were moments when the old magic broke through. The Supreme Court's decision to legalize same-sex marriage in 2015, with the White House lit in rainbow lights. The Paris Climate Agreement, a fragile global step toward confronting the existential threat of climate change. And always that voice, measured, elegant, refusing to surrender to the easy language of rage, even when rage would have been easier. Obama understood, perhaps better than any president since Lincoln, that America was not a finished project. It was a messy, sprawling argument across centuries. A country constantly breaking itself open and trying, stubbornly, imperfectly, to become something better. And he understood something else too, that his very existence as president would provoke a backlash he could not fully stop. His victories and his very presence unleashed forces that would tear through the fabric of the country in ways still unfolding. Racism, long driven underground into code words and polite fictions, erupted back into daylight. Nationalism, once a dark undercurrent, became a rallying cry. Conspiracy theories bloomed like toxic flowers across the internet. Obama left office in 2017 with high approval ratings, but with the country in deeper conflict than it had been in decades. The hope he had offered had not died, but it had become a quieter thing, a stubborn ember rather than a wildfire. He understood, perhaps better than most of his admirers, that change is slow, that the arc of history bends not because it wants to, but because enough hands refuse to let it snap back. In his farewell address, Obama urged Americans not to despair, but to engage, to fight for democracy as an act of faith. Yes, we can, he said, echoing the old campaign slogan. And then one last time, yes, we did. Barack Obama's presidency didn't end the American argument. It reminded us that the argument itself, fierce, brutal, beautiful, is the country. That hope, real hope, isn't passive. It's defiant. It's the refusal to accept the world as it is. It's the stubborn, heartbreaking belief that the dream is worth the fight, even if you never live to see it realized.